Over recent weeks, I've been discussing shame and shame memories and the related evolutionary and biopsychosocial model. But one thing I've noticed over the years is that often shame is placed side by side with guilt. People might refer to shame and guilt as if they are one and the same. However, they are very different emotions arising from very different emotional systems and with very different motivations. So rather than shame and guilt, I thought we might look into shame or guilt and see what we find. Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Many years ago, I read a really fantastic book called Shame, the Exposed Self by Professor Michael Lewis from Rutgers University in New Jersey, USA. This book offers many insights and is well worth a read. But one of the most memorable insights for me was the way that Professor Lewis was able to distinguish shame and guilt with just a very simple turn of phrase. Guilt relates to I've done something bad. Shame relates to I am bad. With guilt, negative feelings are focused on the behaviour or the action, whereas with shame, the focus is on the entire self. Another way of thinking about it is that guilt relates to doing and shame relates to being. So that's a really great place to start when separating shame from guilt. However, as long ago as 1971, the year of my birth in fact, there was a book by another Lewis, Helen Bloch Lewis, called Shame and Guilt in Neurosis. She observed in a study of 2 patients who underwent psychoanalytic treatment that guilt motivates a person to make amends, whereas shame motivates a person to hide. Just as an aside, Helen Bloch Lewis is a giant of psychology and psychoanalysis. From what I've been able to find, she was considered by many to be an outstanding analyst and therapist, supervisor and scholar from the time she entered independent practice in 1945 at the age of 32, right through to her passing in 1987. In fact, I wasn't able to find out nearly enough about her life and contributions, and so if anyone has any more information about Helen Bloch Lewis, please let me know in the comments below. Anyway, back to the question of the video, shame or guilt? And the key seems to be what Helen Bloch Lewis suggested back in her 1971 book, and that is that they both have different motivations. And this is particularly relevant when considering shame and guilt from the perspective of the compassionate mind. Shame, as we've discussed in previous videos, arises out of the threat system, the red circle of that 3 circles model, and has a threat protection motivation. It comes along with a sense of being devalued by others and perhaps devaluing of ourselves. The threat protection motivation is directed towards social threat and defensive strategies designed to keep us safely in the group. But let's think about guilt. Imagine you borrowed something from a friend, their good quality camera say, and you took off the lens and noticed a little bit of fluff inside the camera. Almost as a reflex action, you poked your finger to get the fluff out and smudged the sensor. Now there's a mark on all the images. How would you feel? What might you do? Well, I suppose some people might just shrug and not care. But others might feel terribly, terribly ashamed and very worried about what their friend might now think about them. Perhaps even getting super self-critical and putting themselves down. They might even try to hide what they've done, or delay sending the camera back, or perhaps say that the smudge was already there. As Helen Bloch Lewis said, shame motivates us to hide. But still others might feel sadness, sorrow, or remorse that they damaged their friend's camera. This is a feeling of guilt. And the important thing here is that guilt relates to a caring motivation and arises out of the soothing-affiliative system. This is the green circle and relates to looking after or caring for, nurturing or helping others. When our intention is to be helpful and not harmful, and yet we do cause some sort of harm, then we feel guilt. And the motivation to repair the harm that was caused. We might tell our friend what's happened and take the camera to get it fixed. Shame and guilt come from very different motivational systems in our tricky brains. And it's important. Shame and guilt can often be confused, and yet we want to be able to differentiate those so that we can work with them differently and most effectively. Helen Bloch also wrote, "A corollary notion that we have formed from observation is that shame is intrinsically more difficult to discharge than guilt, particularly because hostility evoked in connection with shame is trapped by the position of the self. So sometimes, as we cultivate the compassionate mind, we work towards shifting from shame to guilt, working with shame and shame memories, working with self-hating self-criticism, and moving away from a global sense of the self as bad, and moving towards our caring motivation and our desire to be helpful rather than harmful, experiencing appropriately guilt linked to our behaviours that were inadvertently harmful, allowing sadness and sorrow, remorse and repair, and of course managing exaggerated guilt and finding balance and equanimity. Shame and guilt are very difficult emotions, and working with them is not always easy, but they are different emotions. Shame has a threat protection motivation and arises out of the threat system. Guilt relates to a caring motivation and arises out of the soothing-affiliative system. We might feel guilty when we harm someone that we care about. Being able to differentiate them is important so that we can work with them differently and most effectively. And also so we can move from shame to guilt and ultimately to compassion and a compassionate motivation towards others and towards ourselves. Thank you for watching my video, and I really appreciate the feedback and encouragement I've been receiving over recent weeks. It means a lot to me. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and I hope we can chat some more about shame and guilt and the compassionate mind. And of course, I wish you all the very best on your compassionate journey.